On Stardate 48315.6, the USS Voyager vanished from known space. It was transported 70,000 light-years across the galaxy and cut off from Starfleet. To protect the ship from the unexplored Delta Quadrant, Chief of Security Tuvok created an elite strike force, the Hazard Team.
Star Trek Elite Force 2 is the sequel to Star Trek Elite Force. It's a game that puts you into the shoes of a member of the Hazard Team, undertaking all manner of missions throughout the Delta Quadrant for the United Federation of Planets.
It is a good day to die.
Not that good a day.
It was developed by Ritual Entertainment, who worked on a couple of Quake map packs in the Awesome Sin, and it was released in 2003 for Microsoft Windows. The prequel was a competent shooting game that was satisfying but somewhat short, so you're probably wondering whether or not the sequel improved upon its predecessor. Well, I'm so glad you asked. Let's just find out, shall we?
Resistance is futile.
Once again, you take on the role of Alex Munro, now promoted to a lieutenant, working on the USS Voyager under Commander Tuvok. In the game's lengthy prologue, your goal is to destroy a containment field that's keeping the Voyager locked inside a Borg sphere. This is similar to the opening from the first game, and I've always found the Borg to be one of the more creepier creations from the Star Trek franchise. What makes them even more spookier is how they only attack you when they consider you a threat. They'll just walk around the place doing maintenance work until you piss them off. Anyone who's played the first game or watched the TV series will know how you can only attack them for so long before they adapt to your weapons, and it's really tense knowing that every single shot you fire on them could potentially be the last. Aside from having a killer atmosphere, these opening levels also show off some cool architecture and impressive texture work considering the game's age. Anyway, after the mission is over, Munro is told that there's no longer any need for the Hazard Team and they are disbanded, with the members all being sent to different branches of the Federation for mundane jobs, with Munro delegated to teaching at the Federation Academy.
Not even a starship? Precisely.
After a 2-year hiatus, Munro runs into Captain Jean-Luc Picard, actually voiced by Patrick Stewart,
Hazard Team.
Who wants to reinstate Munro and his Hazard Team on the USS Enterprise to boldly go where no man has gone before, to explore strange new worlds and all that shit. And this is where the game kinda properly kicks off, introducing a plot involving a race named the Idril that developed a bioweapon known as the Exomorphs, which are kinda like praying mantises and grasshoppers on steroids. Obviously the Idril have lost control of the Exomorphs, and it soon falls upon Munro and the Hazard Team to basically just wipe them all out. In the campaign, you'll visit secret Romulan bases, you'll set foot on a Klingon warbird and interrogate a scumbag in a seedy bar complete with an oversized bouncer and strippers. Not to mention, you're frequently able to move around the Enterprise in between missions, which is pretty damn cool. There's a great sense of focus on the story overall, and there's lots of cinematics where people sit around a table and use all kinds of fancy words that I'm sure fans of the series will be gushing over. In some cinematics you can choose between dialogue options, which have some funny repercussions if you choose the wrong answers.
We don't trade hostages. Then you can die.
It can be a little bit too much to take in at times, and by the end of the game there's so many different factions and races vying for dominance that it is hard to remember who's who. But it is a good story for the most part, and they even let you choose a love interest at the end of the game, allowing you to pick between one of your Hazard Team members or a creepy alien chick that walks around in a bikini all the time.
On the contrary, I'm quite passionate.
This decision will largely come down to whether or not you prefer blondes or brunettes, which, I mean, is an obvious choice. I mean, come on guys, brunettes. Visually, it runs on the Quake III engine, but looks leaps and bounds better than the first game. The real difference is in the character models, which are much more detailed, but also the modelling for weapons and other props in the game world as well. Some levels are a bit barren, but overall it's a much better looking game, and there's a whole crap load of visual options in the game menu. In terms of gameplay, little has been changed. You mostly just shoot everything that moves. There's a fair few guns in the game that follow archetypes like rocket launchers, machine guns, etc. Strangely enough, the shotgun, which they call the assault rifle for some reason, is one of the weakest weapons in the game. Weak in the sense that it's just not that fun to use and lacks any real impact. Level design is challenging without being too relentless. The game gives you a radar which shows the direction of your current goal, but in no way does it hold your hand. During combat, it's not uncommon to be accompanied by your teammates, and they do a pretty good job of helping out with all the bad guys. The game's biggest innovation is the Tricorder, which lets you hack into computer panels to open doors and so forth. This can often involve a little minigame where you have to rotate circuits to correct the flow of energy to a certain point. The Tricorder also has multiple view modes for different situations, which shows where poisonous gas is coming from, for instance, or allows you to see otherwise invisible hazards like tripwires or unstable surfaces. Munro's last trick is a night vision mode, which doesn't get all that much use. In fact, I often forget I even have it, but it is a nice bag of toys to play around with. And the progression of items and weapons throughout the campaign feels just right. You're never given too much new stuff to deal with at one time, and the pacing overall is very well handled. And on that note, there's very little worth complaining about in Star Trek Elite Force 2. I mean, in terms of the overall gameplay, it's more than decent. The problem with this game largely stems from combat. Generally, it's the enemy designs. For the vast majority of the game, I'd say about 2/3 of it, you'll be fighting the exomorphs, and these things are just a pain in the ass. There's about 4 or 5 variants of them with different amounts of health and damage output, but the underlying factor with all of them is that they're just fucking annoying as hell. I don't know where this bug-type enemy trope started with video games. I mean, the first game I can recall seeing them in was Half-Life, but they're just not very fun to go up against. Just by design, they are very irritating to fight. They make this high-pitched screeching noise, and they all just kind of rush to your position and beat the living shit out of you, whilst the rest of them hang back from a distance and throw acid-like projectiles at you. I mean, has anyone ever seriously come up against bug enemy types in games and actually ever looked forward to fighting them? The fact these enemy types overwhelm the majority of the campaign really lets the game down. The areas where you're fighting other humanoid opponents like Klingons and Romulans are much more enjoyable, and it's where the shooting really takes off with the brilliant particle effects and the sound design, but they're kind of overshadowed by the sections where you're forced to fight these legions of exomorphs. I mean, just imagine if in a game like Half-Life, the only other enemy you fought, aside from the Marines, was the Vortigons. That's kind of what it feels like in Elite Force 2. The only other thing I don't like is how they got rid of the holodeck multiplayer mode. This was literally just Quake III reskinned to fit the Star Trek universe, but it was really fun to play. I wish they had have kept it in, because without it, the multiplayer component is seriously lacking. 2003 though was such a good year for shooting games. I mean, we got Viet Cong, Postal 2 and Call of Duty, and Star Trek Elite Force 2 is another great entry into the genre as well. Even if you're not a huge fan of the Star Trek series, which I am not, there is still a lot to get out of this game just from how well it functions as a shooting game. Like its predecessor before it, there is a lot of fun to be had from it whilst you blast your way through its 8 or so hour long story. And I mean, they're even generous enough to give you the choice of 2 women to sleep with. It's one of those games that's just sort of floating in copyright limbo at the moment, so I don't think it matters where you find yourself a copy. And in terms of letting you boldly go where no man has gone before, there are worse ways.